I think it's very, very topical and important that you're organizing this school on the role of the church in the shifting migration context. The other one is to say I think 9 or 10 years ago had the privilege to be at the Ecumenical Social Week of your institute. And I very, very much hope that circumstances will develop in a way that we can happily and without any fear meet in Lviv again. Be assured of our thoughts and prayers.
Thank you very much.
Right. In a lecture like this, there always is a bit of a problem. You have different people, and some people know a lot and have very specific issues, and other people don't know anything. And if you're too specific, you'll lose them. What I will therefore do is that I'll briefly tell you what the organization I serve as General Secretary does, and then I'll tell you a bit about why there's European legislation on migration, what the content of it is, and what recent developments are. And I'll also flag a couple of areas of concern. I estimate that will take 30 to 40 minutes, but then I would very much like us to discuss, because I think that way I can pick up your individual contributions, knowledge, and questions. So a two-part lecture here, and I'm aware that you are coming from very, very different backgrounds. First of all, briefly about CCME, the Church's Commission for Migrants in Europe. We're an organization which was founded 61 years ago. Our main membership is European churches of a Protestant, Orthodox, and Anglican background. We also have agencies related to these churches and Christian councils of churches in various countries as a member. The immediate question which comes is, why don't you like Roman Catholics? It's not that we wouldn't admit Roman Catholic organizations, but the Roman Catholic Church in Europe has numbers of own networks with whom we at Brussels level work very, very closely together. Let me just mention the network of the Catholic Bishops' Conferences, both in Europe and in the EU, Caritas, the Jesuit Refugee Service, or the International Catholic Migration Commission. One of the things we do is very actively follow the legislation on a European level pertaining to asylum, migration, and people in migration, as well as trying to inform our members about it and make the concerns and experiences of churches in Europe heard in that. And I will on Monday talk a little bit more about ecumenical cooperation, but I dare to say already now that the experiences and the concerns we have are not specifically Protestant or Anglican or Orthodox, just as the Roman Catholic colleagues would not come with a Catholic position. It is one of the areas where there's a lot of common ground between the different Christian denominations, which I think makes it also an excellent topic for the discussions of the Ecumenical Institute. The school highlights that there's changing context of migration, but one thing which is pretty continuously there is that migrants are sooner or later confronted with their legal status. Why they are in another country, what that brings for them, what it takes to get to that country, to move on from that country, what their social rights and their residence rights are, rights like connected, for example, to the right to bring their family. Therefore, it has for us as an organization, and I think for similar organizations, always been very, very clear that church cannot only look at the pastoral aspects of migration or look at the theological aspects of migration, but that does need to get into the practical work. And if we find that the practical work is influenced by policy, by legislation, and particularly think that the legislation is far from ideal, we need to influence it. When we're talking about European legislation, the first thing which would come to mind is, why do we need specific European legislation? One of the reasons is, surprisingly enough, that on the international level, legislation is a bit scarce. We have a clear understanding of who a refugee is, and I'll repeat it here. That is laid down in the 1951 Refugee Convention, and that specifically pertains to a person and I'm getting the paper because it is a complicated definition. The Geneva Convention in 1951 described that a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or, owing to such fear, unavailable himself of the protection of that country, or who's not having a nationality, being outside the country of his former habitual residence, is unable, owing to such fear, to return to it. So 3 central elements. The element the person needs to be out of the country, have a well-founded fear of, and then it's mentioned, being persecuted on a number of reasons, and for that reason being unable to return to the country of origin. These are the 3 main factors. And let us once again look at the reasons why a person may be persecuted. That may be race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. It's a complicated definition, but once you got the hang of it, I think it is rather clear. It is very, very much influenced by the experiences of World War II, and particularly the deeds of Nazi Germany, which was persecuting people like Jews on the basis of their religion, or other people on the basis of their political opinion. That was why in 1951 it was formulated like that. What we see is that there's at least 2 major problems. A, this only goes for people who are individually targeted. So it doesn't go for anybody who's in a place of war and flees. You, in order to be really identified as a refugee, you need to prove that you're individually targeted. And the second point is, we have a number of reasons which are given here, but if we would look at them today, we would probably add quite a few. Like, for example, what's always been there, part of the debate has always been, well, what about economic refugees? Yes, we have the Geneva Convention, who doesn't say if somebody is economically disadvantaged, he or she qualifies as a refugee. But for a lot of people in countries where there's hunger, the question, if I die because somebody had a gun against my head, or because I'm starving, is relatively academical. That's the first one. And the second discussion, which is increasingly coming, what about people who have to flee, can't go to their country of origin because of environmental degradation? So these are already 2 big question marks. Having said that, in the area of who is a refugee, we have a clear framework internationally. Contrary to that, there's very little binding and clear definition on who's a migrant. And that is very, very surprising, given that it's such a clear discussion and topical discussion. There are some academics and some UN agencies who have tried to offer definition, and that usually means that an international migrant is a person who's outside their country of habitual residence or nationality for longer than a year. But that is not contrary to the refugee definition. There's no international contract which regulates that, or convention. And that is quite surprising. We, a number of years ago, had two international agreements on migration, one the Compact on Refugees, one on migration. But the one on migration doesn't say who is a migrant. On the basis of that, there is a certain need to have regulations, and the European approach has been that the most binding instruments are on a European level. And we have several actors which are coming into the picture. I will devote most of my time to the European Union, but as we know, the European Union is a big entity with 27 members, but quite a few countries in Europe are not member of the European Union. We have, for the larger Europe, the Council of Europe, depending on how you count Belarus, 47 or 48 member states. So it would be logical to look for European legislation there. The point is, there's very little conventions of the Council of Europe on migration, and that's surprising. The Council of Europe does say very little about refugees. It does have one convention on migrant workers, so people who are moving from one country to the other for the purposes of taking up work. The problem with that instrument is, out of the 47 member countries of the Council of Europe, only 11 have signed it, and even worse, only 4 have then ratified it in their national parliaments. So there's not a lot we can gain from this. The Council of Europe is, however, quite important for a number of migration-related questions, and that is down to the fact that it has the European Convention on Human Rights. And the European Convention on Human Rights doesn't say anything on migration or asylum, but it says quite a few things which do apply for refugees and migrants alike. So one of the most important one is the prohibition of torture and inhumane or degrading treatment in Article 3. There's Article 6, which guarantees the right to a fair trial. There's Article 8 with the right to respect for private and family life. Article 14 for prohibition of discrimination, and Article 13, which gives anyone the right to an effective remedy. And by way of interpreting the European Convention of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights has, in a number of very, very important judgments, pronounced itself on the rights of migrants and refugees and persons seeking asylum, particularly when the European Court for Human Rights had the impression that conditions, for example, for asylum-seeking persons in a country like Greece, were a violation of their rights and leading to torture and or degrading treatment. So we have nothing really in the Council of Europe very explicitly on refugees and migrants, which is important, but by way of looking how the human rights of everybody in a Council of Europe member state are affected, and including in that refugee, migrants, asylum-seeking persons, the European Court of Human Rights has come to a number of important court judgments. Is that clear so far? If you have anything which is unclear, wave at me, then and ask me what exactly. That seems to be relatively clear then. I should probably also say that there's another pan-European or even larger than European body, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. You will remember that was the organization this year celebrated its 50th birthday. It emanated from a conference in 1975, the so-called Helsinki Agreements, on the one hand, political stabilization and détente between the different Eastern and Western powers in Europe, and then attached to it a number of human rights considerations. The organization still does advise on human rights in that context, occasionally also advises on migration, but it doesn't have any specific working field there. Contrary to that, the European Union, with, as I said, 27 EU member states, has quite an impressive legislation on migration over the last 25 years. And there's a reason behind it. One of the things which characterizes the European Union and which is often presented as one of its success stories is that, and I should say in normal times until 2-3 years ago, there's borderless travel. In principle, and as I said, at the moment, there's some derogations from that, but in principle, anybody who arrives in Finland can, without ever being controlled, travel all the way down to Portugal, and somebody who arrives here in Belgium can go all the way down to Bulgaria. A result of that is that, of course, those people who are in Portugal, in government in Portugal, need to have good faith that the people who let people in Finland or in Bulgaria are applying more or less of the same standards. So if you have no longer internal controls, you need to have certain agreements between the 27 member states of the EU who gets in and under which conditions. The idea was discussed in the 1990s and became part of what the European Union is doing in the year 1999. The year 1999 was also politically characterized by a number of new, more liberal governments coming to power in the European Union. It was the German government. There was a center-left majority in France. 2 years before that, a new Labour government had taken over responsibility in the UK, which was at that time still a member. So there was a certain wave of human rights-oriented liberal politicians in power. And Europe at that time came out of a major conflict with major displacement as a result of Yugoslavia falling apart. We have all the different wars in the countries and between the countries of former Yugoslavia, and there was a general feeling that Europe could have done better. There was a feeling that a number of countries, particularly Germany and Austria, received quite a lot of those people fleeing conflict, and that other countries didn't do anything. There was also the notion that a lot of those asking for asylum arrived in one country, applied for asylum, then moved on to another country, applied there again, and so forth. So the idea in 1999 was we need to have a minimum set of common understandings in a couple of areas. And the areas were very clearly defined in what's known as the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. And I'll read the most important things to you. So from 1999 onwards, what the EU agreed that it would have a uniform status of asylum for third country nationals. This all refers to third country nationals, so people who are not member of any EU member state. They would have a uniform status for subsidiary forms of protection. And I'll come to the explanation of what that is in a minute. There would be a system of temporary protection. And I think anybody who's been involved in the last 3-4 years and who has seen the terrible exodus from Ukraine as a result of the Russian attack will have heard about temporary protection, because that was a relatively good instrument which allowed to have 4 or 5 million arriving within the EU and having relatively unbureaucratic procedures of taking care of them. It was also that one should have common procedure for granting and withdrawing an asylum status and criteria which member state is responsible. And then last but not least, standards concerning the reception conditions. So to summarize, what the EU wanted to agree on is a common understanding who qualifies as a refugee. So, and problem of that is, and it was at the beginning, it still is, you will, for example, have groups, and I'm citing now here Afghans, who until this very day in Austria have a 70% chance of being recognized. Just across the Danube in Bratislava, in Slovakia, their chance is 2%. So we see that there's still a lot of work to be done here, but in theory, a person who's, and I'm coming back to the example, lands in Finland, from a specific group should have the same chance of being recognized as a person would have in Portugal. This was also complemented by certain standards on how do these procedures work. And in the procedures, the devil's always in the detail. But one of the questions which was agreed, for example, to which extent should legal counseling be provided or legal assistance to a person who's in an asylum procedure. An additional element, for example, it may seem small, or you might forget about it, is their interpretation. Is their interpretation into the language of the person, him or herself, or as it is at the moment, is their interpretation into a language which this person most probably understands. So if we, for example, again, we take Afghans, if somebody from Afghanistan is landing somewhere and is interviewed, does this person have to get interpretation in one of the Afghan languages? Or is it good enough to say we translate into Russian because we believe you understand some Russian? So as you see, these little details about procedure are extremely important. And the third question which was important to regulate is, what are the living conditions? How are they housed? Do they get a certain allowance? What are the standards for food? What are the medical needs? And so forth. Because as we've seen, particularly in the year 2015, when quite a few persons seeking asylum arrived in the EU, They usually arrived at the eastern and southeastern border, particularly in Greece, but a lot of them moved on, knowing that the Greek system was very, very weak, and that in Sweden or in Germany they probably would have a roof over their house and qualified interpretation. And the last thing which was agreed was which member state is responsible for looking at an asylum application. Here, the principle is every asylum-seeking person should have a chance. So it shouldn't be that a person is pushed back and forth between all the countries and doesn't have a chance, but it should also be only one chance. So what was accompanying this was that the big database was built up in which any person who applies for asylum leaves fingerprints. And this is accessible from all over the EU for the authorities. So you might have it that a person in Denmark asks for asylum, is then asked to leave his fingerprints, and Denmark then Danish authorities would look at it and say, oh, we see you've already asked for asylum in Italy, and unless, with very few exceptions, this person would then have to go back to Italy, to the country where he or she first came in. So that's what's been agreed on asylum. Asylum is, as we know, not the only aspect of this legislation. So one has also agreed that there should be a cooperation on immigration. Here, however, it is a bit more complex because the EU should adopt legislation which is defining the conditions of entry and residence for people, for example, for labor or for family reunification. What is important is that the EU has competence to define how the procedure works, but the EU has no competence and no right to define how many people are coming in. So the EU can say, if you want to come as a labor migrant or you want to become an independent worker in the EU, these and these are the common procedures, but it is up to any member state to say, and we allow 3 people or 300,000. And that at the moment is something which is still very difficult because a lot of migration is mixed migration, where you have some people seeking asylum, but others probably more coming for labor migration. And we have a very clear rule between the EU member states on asylum, but we only have a few elements on other forms of migration. And then importantly, the EU was also given the task to find common policies on illegal migration and unauthorized residence, including removal and repatriation. So this is very simplified all the legislation the EU has taken in the last couple of years. And as I said, the whole procedure started in 1999. It has always taken quite a long time from the initial idea to something to be adopted. I spare you all the details, but in principle, you need a vast majority, a qualified majority of all the member states, and you need a qualified majority of the directly elected European Parliament for any proposal to become the rule. And that has usually meant that from the moment something was proposed to the moment it was adopted, there was a time frame of 3 to 4 years. We had the first round of things being adopted in 2004. We then had a second one of refining them in 2010, 2011. And then between there have been several attempts to overhaul the legislative system again. They were only successful last year in 2024, when a number of new rules was agreed. So basically there's been three waves of trying to harmonize it. The first one was really agreeing on very basic things. The second one was already taking into consideration what experiences had been made in the first phase. And the third one now is building on experiences with the system and the way it functions or doesn't function. I'll tell you very, very briefly a short assessment of what these harmonizations and this legislation has brought about. We, as CCME, and I think other church organizations have held the similar position, think that the system which had been agreed in 2010, 2011 was as such a very good system, but it's never been fully implemented. The problem is that the EU has decided on framework legislation, and then each member state needs to have its own law up until now. It needs to have its own law. So Luxembourg, for example, would need to look at the so-called directive on asylum procedure and look, is the legislation we have nationally up to speed with it? Is it in coherence? And that was already the main problem out of the, at the moment, 27 member states of the EU. A lot of member states have looked at their laws and said, yeah, will work more or less. And then when it came to taking the consequences, so having practical consequences of the legislation, for example, about having enough reception capacity, a lot of the member states have not done anything. So, for example, I have described to you that in principle, it's usually the state in which somebody first enters the EU which is responsible for an asylum application. I remember in 2013 talking to the head of the asylum reception system in Hungary. And I asked him, well, how many people do you have coming every month? And he said, well, around 2,000. Okay. And I asked him, how much places do you have? And he said, well, 3,000. And I then said, well, but that means after 6 weeks you're full. And he said, yeah, but they move on. And that was in many member states, the spirit of saying, we have a law, but we're not really respecting it very much. Our line would have been to say, at that point, the European Commission, and I spare you also here all the details, but there is a procedure by which the European Commission can make sure that European Union member states are respecting and implementing the legislation, but they have not done that. So, as we've seen in 2015, 1 million people arrived. That was quite a big group, admittedly. But in principle, at that time, the EU had 500 million inhabitants. In principle, a community of 500 million should be able to deal with 1 million. But at that time, the obligations had not been met, and the fact that the EU had laws but hadn't implemented them nationally really came to haunt. And ever since then, the discussion has been, there's too many people coming to Europe. I know that there's quite a few people here in the call who have experiences outside Europe. I think most of us will find that absolutely crazy, because Europe is a pretty rich continent and has relatively small proportions if we compare it with countries like Turkey, with countries like Iran, with countries like Uganda, with countries of Lebanon, which are extremely poor, have social conflicts internally, and are hosting proportionally far bigger groups. But the discourse in the EU since 2015 is there's too many people coming. And many are then saying, because it's too nice here in the EU. So what we have seen in the last couple of years, and the legislation adopted in 2024 is also an expression of that, is an attempt to get the standards lower. So to say, well, we provide the absolute minimum. Nobody should be coming here to take our money, to have a nice life, claiming asylum. We provide the absolute minimum. And another aspect, which is in practical cooperation, but also more and more in other areas coming, is that the EU tries to keep people at the border. One of the very central elements of one of the newly adopted laws is that a significant proportion of the people who enter the EU are kept at the borders in a state where they are legally considered not yet to have entered the EU, and that they at the borders are within 4 weeks getting a decision, in some cases 8 weeks, about their asylum application. In principle, that's a nice idea that people get a decision within a short period of time. But the reality is that the fastest member state at the moment has an asylum procedure for 9 months. So at the moment, the authorities need 9 months to assess an asylum application. Now they're expected to do it in 4 to 8 weeks. And one of the big concerns is that this will lead to very superficial procedures where the individual cases are not heard and more decided on, you come from country X, then we assume everything is fine and we send you back. Another question which comes to that is if you keep a very significant number of people at the borders, what will be the conditions? And anybody who's seen the pictures from the camps in Italy or in Greece over the last decades will be worried, I think. Another thing which we are seeing is a cooperation with third countries. It started first with 2016, where there was an agreement between the EU member states and Turkey to say Turkey stops everybody coming into the EU. If people come from Turkey into the EU has the right to send them back to Turkey immediately so that their asylum procedure is heard. And to be clear, Turkey is doing in many, many cases a wonderful job. There's some very good infrastructure in Turkey, but the Turkish asylum and immigration law does, for quite a few countries, not foresee a secure status. And what we're seeing is that whenever the political mood changes in Turkey, people are sent back, for example, directly to Syria or Afghanistan without any individual check of their application. So saying from somebody who lands in Greece to say, oh, well, you can go to Turkey and you're safe there, may work for the moment, but in the long hand is a very, very difficult exercise and potentially life-threatening. Last point, this cooperation with Turkey is now the blueprint for a lot of cooperations, and that is cooperation with countries like Libya, countries like Tunisia, countries like Egypt, in which these countries are asked to stop people on their way to Europe. And I've mentioned Libya, Egypt, Tunisia. Anybody who knows a little bit about these countries will have absolute horror at the thought that people are being kept at the border by these countries. And what we are seeing is that in Tunisia, that in Algeria, that in Egypt, the authorities are having an extremely aggressive stance towards people who are trying to transit their territory and often resort to criminal activities like, for example, taking people who've arrived in the north of Tunisia from where it is relatively close to the Italian islands, taking them and dumping them in the southern desert. And lots of people have died. So what we are seeing at the moment, that a system which is as such a good thing and which was there to agree on standards for rights of the most vulnerable has become a system of stopping people to exercise their rights. And as I said, for our understanding, the problem of that is that the so-called migration crisis in 2015, 2016 has not been analyzed. Not been analyzed in the sense of our system wasn't good, but there's too many people coming because we're too nice to them. And that is the fundamental problem we're seeing at the moment. And we see that in many, many different aspects. We can go into some of the technicalities at the moment, but we're seeing more and more that the EU is trying to change legislation in the way which would allow them to have something similar to what the UK did with Rwanda, namely that you intercept people who want to get onto your territory and send them to a country they've never been to. So far, the main ideals were to say we can send people back to countries they transited through, but the new legislation which is proposed, not yet adopted, would allow EU countries to send people to any third country they have an agreement with. And the second point is we're at the moment also having a very, very big debate on return. There is an old legislation on it of the year 2008. Once again, in our view, not ideal, but a useful piece of legislation. But a lot of the EU member states are coming back and saying, well, we find it very difficult to return these people under this because we need to respect too many of their rights. So what is now proposed is that people can be much more easily returned, that, for example, a legal challenge of a decision that somebody should be returned to another country will not have suspensive effect. That can, for example, mean that somebody gets an order to leave the territory, appeals against it, but then is removed already, and that the judge later on say, well, that person shouldn't have been removed. But of course, by that point in time, the person is gone. So there's a lot of things which are, on the one hand, in our view, very, very difficult, inhumane, and in addition to that, also very, very much call into question certain cornerstones of our legal system. So at the moment, we are very, very concerned that central elements of a legislation which should be facilitating access to asylum is turned around into a direction which de facto blocks access to asylum. Big question, what do we need to do? Our point is that as long as the conflicts and the reason for displacement are there, as long as people are rather putting themselves onto a rather dangerous boat in the Mediterranean, risking their lives, than staying in their country of origin or the country they're there, as long as this is the case, people will come. Even if it's made most impossible for them, people will come. What the current policy will do is make it more difficult for them. And that will mean that they will have to pay more money to the smugglers and that they're more likely to risk their lives sooner or later. Our idea, therefore, is and we have it under the slogan, protecting people more than borders, is to say we need a system which starts from an assumption of saying, let's assume that 1 million people will be coming every year. What is the infrastructure we need for that? What's the legislation we need for that? What do we need to formulate as expectations towards those who are coming and who want to stay? And how do we get that done socially? How can social integration work? How can people find jobs and so forth? It is an ambitious one. And we're often hearing, "Naya, you're the churches, you're always peace-loving." That's unrealistic. But we are refusing to assume that people dying at the borders or people being treated like subhumans is a realistic option. That's where our value comes in. And that's also where, at a certain point, simple common sense comes in. We are hearing everywhere, we don't have money for this, we don't have money for that. But if there's discussion about borders and the technical equipment and the staff you need, there's no question asked. So we think that a lot of the money which is at the moment used to keep people out and de facto putting them into misery can be used in more creative way to make it work and to have a continent which protects people more than borders. I leave it here. I've talked for almost 40 minutes, and I saw some